guys, it's Marissa and Kyle. We are live from the dock at Project Oceanology. So today we want to talk to you guys a little bit about an organism that is very plentiful in Long Island Sound and very important to the ecosystem here. So what we're going to be doing, we have a net. Any idea what we'd be looking to catch here today? So you can see that it's got a pretty fine mesh. It's got a big metal ring around the outside, and at the bottom there is a bottle. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna try to find an animal called a plankton. So you wanna go ahead and start catching?
Yeah, I'll show you how we collect a sample of these organisms here. We're going to be using this net, dragging it along the surface of the water here, and we'll see what we can catch. Perfect.
So while Kyle is getting our plankton sample, I want to describe to you a little bit about what a plankton is. So if you do know what a plankton is, that is great, but if not, you're gonna hopefully learn a few things today. So most people, when they think of a plankton, they think of a very small organism, but that is not always the case. So there are some plankton that are actually taller than both myself and Kyle. And you guys might have encountered some of them while at your time at the beach. So that would be a jellyfish. So jellyfish are not small necessarily. Some of them, like I said, can be very, very large. So if they are a plankton, then what defines something as a plankton? So it actually has to do with their movement. So to be a plankton, the word planktos means wanderer or drifter in Greek. So that basically means that they are floating around the surface and they are subject to the tide, to the wind, and the waves. So they don't really, even though they can move a little bit, they don't really have the choice of going exactly where they want. So if you've ever been swimming at a local beach and you've unfortunately, probably like me, gotten some water in your mouth, whether you like it or not, you've probably actually had plankton in your mouth as well. Sorry to break it to you. So most of them are very small, and we're gonna go back up to the building in a little while and we're gonna look at them under a microscope so we can look a little closer, because a majority of them are small enough that you want to use that. So now that we kind of have an idea of what plankton is, we are going to talk about the different categories of plankton. So there are two main categories. There are a phytoplankton and a zooplankton. So phytoplankton is just like a plant type of plankton. So they use the power of the sun and nutrients to undergo photosynthesis to create their own food. So like a plant, they have chlorophyll, which actually makes them a green color. I'm gonna see if I can turn this around and show you the color of the water today. So you can kind of see that it's got a greenish hue to it. Because there are millions of plankton in the water right now. So another great thing about these phytoplankton is also, just like a plant, they are creating their own oxygen as well. Well, oxygen for us, I should say. I'm sorry. So let's all do an exercise together and let's take some deep breaths. Kyle, you want to take some breaths with me?
Sure.
All right, let's take 3 deep breaths. Ready? In. 1 and 2. And 3. So we took 3 deep breaths in, and about 2 of those breaths was oxygen that was actually created from phytoplankton rather than plants. So phytoplankton create about 50 to 70% of the oxygen on the earth, which is pretty awesome. Are you done with your toe?
So we did a couple passes along the dock, and we'll see if we can get a little close-up on here, and you might be able to see lots of little things kind of scattered, peppered throughout this sample. But it's a pretty plentiful sample, and we can get a better look at it under the microscope in the lab and see what kinds of animals and phytoplankton that we caught here.
Perfect. So we're gonna start to head up to the lab. And while we're doing that, I want you guys to think of animals that you would think of when going to Long Island Sound. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to add them in the comments. I'm gonna try to look at them in just a minute. And while we're walking, I'd like to say thank you guys to tuning into our first ever Facebook Live for both Kyle and I. So we're really excited that you guys are here to kind of listen to what we have to say. What would you like to add, Kyle? I can't read the screen yet.
Well, hold on 1 second. Let me close this gate real quick. All right.
Safety first, people. Perfect.
So Marissa asked you all to think of some animals that that you might think of when you visit Long Island Sound. I'll try and see if when we get into the building we can read your comments. But some of the animals that you might think of in Long Island Sound might start out their life as plankton. They may grow up and become considered not plankton afterwards. There's two different larger categories of those zooplankton, the animal type plankton that we can talk about. There's the holoplankton and the miroplankton. Holoplankton spend their whole life as plankton, and we'll get an example of those once we look at the microscope. And the other one is called miroplankton. Miroplankton spend merely part of their life as plankton. So usually when they're first born or hatched from their eggs, they're usually pretty small. And then as they eat and grow, they gain mass and might become heavy enough to sink down to the bottom and start living their life as an adult in the bottom of the sound, or they might be big enough to swim against a current. So try and think of some examples of those animals that might start out their life as plankton.
So one example of a holoplankton, one that spends their whole life as plankton, is one that you parents probably know more than you want to. So if you have ever seen, or your kids have seen the show SpongeBob, the plankton from SpongeBob is actually modeled after a real life plankton that spends its whole life as a plankton called a copepod. So we are going to be setting up our microscope, and we're going to be looking at our plankton sample underneath this microscope, which is going to actually project onto the whiteboard of our lab. So let me turn it around so you can kind of get a view of what we're looking at here while Kyle is setting it up. So Kyle, Iris wants to know why most plankton are so small.
Well, most plankton are small because it's sort of, when you have a small body, it's easier to float. And a lot of plankton like to float up near the surface. You notice that's where I was fishing for them. And that's so that they can stay up at the surface where there's a lot of sunlight. Those phytoplankton need that sunlight to undergo photosynthesis so they can produce sugars in their body and create energy so they can live their lives. And those zooplankton want to be up at the surface as well because they're going to be eating the phytoplankton and smaller zooplankton. So that's why they usually tend to be pretty small. It's so that it's easier for them to kind of float up. So that's a really good question. Let's see. And we can see some of those small animals here in just a second.
So I have a few other friends that want to know what plankton eat. So it actually depends, flip it back for a minute. It actually depends on what type of plankton you're talking about. So before, when I was telling you about the phytoplankton, they're actually producing their own food, just like plants do, using sunlight and nutrients through photosynthesis. So the zooplankton actually eat the phytoplankton. So the phytoplankton are the bottom of the food chain out here, and that is why they're so important. And the zooplankton, they're eating them, are also being eaten by smaller fish and other organisms as well. All right, let's take a look at our sample. Let me get a little closer so you can see. And I'll try to stand still so you can see them moving. Oh, do you see some movement? So if you see those little guys down there that have the two large antennae and the tail, those are the copepods that I was telling you about. They're the ones that are used as a model for the plankton from SpongeBob. So their species is very famous, whether they know it or not. Oh, there's a really good example of another one right here. And you'll see that these guys are kind of zipping around the picture. So they, like I said before, they can move a little bit, but it's much more kind of like jumping around rather than swimming with a purpose. Okay. Kyle, Greta also wants us to know that pufferfish are an example of something that is a plankton when they're younger.
Exactly. So some fish species can even be considered planktonic, usually when they're smaller, and that would be an example of those muroplankton. Another good example of a muroplankton that you may not have thought of would be these little creatures right here. You may not be able to make out the spiral in their shell, but these are actually juvenile snails. Right? So when they first hatch from their eggs, they're really, really tiny, and they're floating around grazing on phytoplankton usually, depending on the species. And then the more they eat, the more they grow. The more they grow, the heavier they get, and then they can sink down to the bottom and start crawling around in that benthic zone. So that would be another example of a muroplankton. Let's see. I did see also something that's pretty exciting in here. And we talked about those big jellyfish. Let's see if I can find it. Ooh, there it is.
Oh my.
So you can see compared to the rest of the sample, or the rest of the organisms in our sample, these jellyfish can be considerably larger than other zooplankton. What's that? Turn around.
No, can you kind of outline the outside of the
Oh, yeah.
jellyfish just so they can kind of
So you may
see?
be able to see the tentacles where my cursor is pointing, and they're moving around, but the bell part, the big part of the animal's body, goes all the way down here and takes up the entire frame. Yeah. And you can see some smaller plankton zipping around in the sample as well.
Perfect. So this is an example of a holoplankton. These jellyfish are spending their entire life cycle as plankton. And they're also, this one is obviously much smaller than the other ones that we were talking about. So there's a wide size range. Oh.
Now it's really exciting for us to be able to go out off the docks here and see what kinds of organisms are living there. But it's also a pretty important scientific practice. We can do samples like that off the EnviroLab research vessels at different locations, maybe at the mouth of the Thames River or other rivers in Connecticut where there's a lot of fresh water flowing in. We can go into the middle of the sound where the water chemistry might be a little bit different, and we can see what sorts of populations of organisms are living in different areas. Now, all the animals in this sample are moving around, so it's really nice to observe, and you can observe their behaviors. But if you wanted to kind of get a qualitative assessment, or which basically means see how many there are of a certain species or the strength of a population, we could actually do what's called fixing the sample, so they're not moving around, and we can count how many of each one that we have. And that can give us a lot of information about the strength of different populations, seeing if certain animals are reproducing and if their juveniles are surviving.
Kyle, can you take a marker and just outline the outside of that jellyfish? I want to make sure that they can see just how big this jellyfish is, especially compared to a copepod when they swim by.
So we have the bell right here with the tentacles attached, so you can see just how long they go. But that whole size there compared to, let's say, if I can fit one of the copepods in that shape, and see how big they are compared. Well, there's that little snail and a copepod.
All right.
You fit a snail and a copepod in there.
So you can see the outline of the bell that Kyle drew, and you can see a copepod right there. So you can see just the size difference of these two planktons. So there are a bunch of different sizes that a plankton can be. So that was a really cool find to see today. So Kyle, we have some folks who love to eat some seafood.
Mm-hmm.
Is any of that yummy seafood also plankton?
Oh, sure. So probably one of the most popular seafood items on the east coast of America would be the American lobster, Omerus americanus. And they start out their life as plankton as well. So female lobsters will release thousands of eggs or hold thousands of eggs on their abdomen, and then when they're ready to hatch, they kind of shake them into the water. Those babies hatch and become free-swimming zooplankton. And they'll spend time grazing on phytoplankton and smaller zooplankton until they can get big enough to sink down to the bottom and walk along the rocky bottom of the Long Island Sound. So that would be a good example. If you're into calamari, squid, when they first hatch from their eggs, they're also considered zooplankton. And they grow very quickly. So they go from about the size of a grain of rice when they hatch from their eggs, little zooplankton zipping around, feeding on zooplankton that can be 4 times their size, like mysid shrimp and other crustaceans, until they get up to about 50 centimeters or so in just a few months. So it doesn't take long for them to go from that neuroplankton into a free-swimming individual as an adult.
Perfect. All right, so let's look at some of your questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them so that we can take a look. So we have some people who know a lot about plankton, Kyle.
Oh, cool.
So do any larger organisms also eat plankton other than fish?
Oh, absolutely. So there are some species of large fish, like the basking shark is a really big species of shark, and they're a filter feeder. So they swim around with that really big mouth open and just screening out all the plankton that they can get. Also, some of you may have heard of baleen whales, really large marine mammals that feed on plankton. So some of the biggest animals in the world are actually feeding on some of the smallest ones. They just have to eat a lot of them. So that's a really good question.
And our friend Graham also told us that clams also eat plankton.
That's true.
So they're filtering the water for some yummy food.
In Long Island Sound and all over the world rely on plankton populations for food. There are the bivalves like the clams, filter feeding, lots of animals including sardines and anchovies, small fish, all the way up to the big baleen whales. These phytoplankton, the phytoplankton are the basis of all food chains in the marine ecosystem, whether animals are eating them directly or not, because they're taking energy from the sun and nutrients to the water and putting that energy up the food chain until you get to the very top where we are and the really big fish and sharks and seals are.
Awesome. And Greta also wants us to know that horseshoe crabs are plankton too when they're babies.
Yeah.
Those are some of our favorite critters here at Project Oceanology. So I'm really glad that you shared that, Greta.
Absolutely. And when they're plankton, they actually look just like an adult horseshoe crab, but without their tail, without the telson. They just have like that little horseshoe-shaped body. So, and they're really cute.
Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed our first ever Facebook Live. We're so glad that you guys could come hang out with us for a few minutes this morning. We hope that you guys are able to get outside and maybe look at some of the organisms that are right in your backyard. Open a log or pick up a rock and just see what you can find. So thank you guys, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Have a good day.
Bye now.
Bye.